Hello everyone. In this session, we want to talk about cloning a domain controller. The cloning feature is a feature that was introduced in Server 2012. Prior to Server 2012, the process of adding an additional virtual domain controller involved copying data using one of two options during the domain controller promotion process, either replicating the data over the network or using the install from media option. As you can imagine, depending on the size of the Active Directory database, ntds.dit, it would take a considerable amount of time to copy the Active Directory database with either of those options. So we have this new option in Server 2012, and this option allows us to speed up the process of building new additional domain controllers. Not only will it save time, but it also will save time when it comes to provisioning the domain controllers for rapid deployment on your network. The domain controllers that we are referring to here are usually virtual domain controllers. Before we can clone a virtual domain controller, there are some requirements that need to be in place. The first requirement, and these are basic requirements because there's some other requirements that we will talk about. The source virtual DC. This is the DC that you are going to be cloning. It has to be running Windows Server 2012. Another requirement is that the PDC emulator role holder, whichever system has the role PDC emulator, that has to be online and available to the cloned domain controller. So when we clone the domain controller and the cloned domain controller is ready to run, there must be a PDC emulator role holder online, and it has to be running Windows Server 2012. Another requirement is that the forest functional level has to be Windows Server 2003 or higher. There is a new group in the user's container, and it is called clonable domain controllers. If a system is to be cloned, that system has to be a member of the clonable domain controllers group. So membership in this group will dictate whether a domain controller can or cannot be cloned. This group has some permissions set on the domain head that should not be removed. If you remove these permissions, it will cause the cloning to fail. Also, as a best practice, domain controller shouldn't be added to the group until you are ready to clone. And after you have cloned, the domain controller should be removed from the group once that cloning is complete. The cloned DC, the DC that you will clone, will also end up in the clonable domain controllers group. So you want to make sure to remove those as well. The first step that we want to take in cloning is adding the source DC to the domain controllers group. After we have done that, we need to run a PowerShell command that will allow us to find out the applications that will be excluded from cloning. There are some applications that will not clone, so you need to run that command, because if you run step 3, where we have to generate the DC clone config file, which is the file with all the settings for the new cloned machine, it will give you an error. It will not run if there are applications that cannot be cloned. So one good thing to do first would be to run the command that would allow you to find out those applications that will not clone. When we do step 3, where we run the generate DC config.xml file, we are using the commandlet new ad DC clone config file. Then we're going to add the IP address, the default gateway, the subnet mask, the DNS, the site name. All of these variables we add into the file. And when that file, the new cloned file, boots, these are the attributes that they're going to boot with. You can also configure this file manually, and we'll show you how you can do that. So that DC clone config file is going to be the result of running the new ADC Active Directory Domain Controller clone config file. Let's take a look. We're going to begin the cloning process by going into Active Directory, Users and Computers. And we want to access the clonable domain controllers group. Let's click on it. And we want to right click on Properties, and click on Members. Because remember, our first step is to add the source DC to the clonable domain controllers group. So we're going to click on Add. And for object types, we want to make sure that we have the computer object type before we look for that computer. So I'm going to click on Object Types, and I'm going to make sure that Computers is ticked off. Then I can say OK. Now I can search for it. Advanced, Find Now, and we're looking for DC. The domain controller is called DC, so we're going to click on DC. Click on OK twice. Click on OK a third time. We can see here that DC is now a member of the clonable domain controllers group. Let's close Active Directory Users and Computers. And our next task is to find out the applications that will not be cloned. And once we find that out, we're going to exclude them. Meaning that if we don't exclude them and we run the command to create the cloned machine, we will have a problem, and we will see that we will get errors. So before you run that command to create that DC clone config file, which will have all the settings that we need for the clone's domain controller, we have to first find the applications or roles or features that will not be cloned, and we will have to exclude them from the list. Or if we find out that they can indeed be cloned, then we can add them to the allowed clone list. First, we're going to run the command prompt. I'm going to click on Tools, Active Directory Module for PowerShell. You can also do this from the PowerShell prompt that is on the taskbar, because as soon as you run an Active Directory commandlet, you will see that you will be into the Active Directory module for Windows PowerShell. So we're going to run this command, get Active Directory cloning excluded application list. Get hyphen ADDC cloning excluded application list with no space. Let's check the command before we run it again. Get ADDC cloning excluded application list, and we want to press enter to execute that command. And there are a number of them, as you can see here. You have the name and you have the service. Those represent the applications that will give you a problem when you try to run the commandlet to create the cloned domain controller. We want to add these applications to the allowed list. That when we generate this XML file, these applications will not pose a problem for us. Let's run that command again because it's the same command, but at the end of the command, you have to type generate XML. So we're going to do that. Hyphen generate XML. And it's going to add the applications into the allowed list so that they will not give a problem when we're getting ready to run the command that will create the DC clone config file. So we're going to press enter. And you can see the inclusion list was written to C Windows NTDS custom DC cloned allow list. So what you have done is added those to the allow list. And now when you are ready to run your command to create the cloned file, you will not get an error. We're going to type the command that will create the config file. And we start with new. Active Directory controller. So that is Active Directory ADDC clone config file. Config file. Static. And we want to put in the DNS resolver. So that's hyphen IP version 4 DNS resolver. And we're going to put 10. Let's put 192.168. 1025 and 192.168.10.30. We also want to put in the name that we're going to give that clone DC. So our parameter is clone computer name. And we're going to give it server 12. That's the name that we're going to give to our clone DC. We also want to put in the site name. And the site name is going to be default for site. Site. Name. Let's look at that command again. New. And we need a hyphen after new. Let's put a hyphen. Because the commandlet is new hyphen addc clone config file. Static addresses. The DNS resolver, IP version 4 DNS resolver. We're giving two DNS addresses, 192.168.10.25 and 192.168.10.30. We're going to call the cloned computer server 12, and we're going to put the site name as default first site name. Let's try running that command, and remember that these are just basic settings. We can go into the local file where it's created, and we can add or remove other settings. Let's press enter to execute the command. Let's take another look at the command. New Active Directory domain controller clone config file, the IP4 DNS resolver, the two DNS addresses, the name that we give to the clone computer, and the site name. And we can see that all the tests are being run. They test to see whether or not the source is a member of the domain controllers group in Active Directory. It's verifying authorization to that group. You can see it here, Clonable Domain Controllers Group. They're running other tests. One of the tests would be that there's nothing blocking this file from being created. Remember that we ran the command that allowed the applications that could not be cloned to be added to the allow list. If we didn't do that, we would get an error when we were running this file. So let's scroll down. All preliminary validation checks pass, and it started the creation of the clone config file. And we can see that the clone configuration file has been created. What we want to do now is to go and edit that file to put in the other settings that we need to put in. At the command prompt, we're going to type Notepad, C, Windows, and this is the path where the file exists that we just created, NTDS, so the file goes into NTDS folder. We need to type the name of the file. So when we create that file goes into the NTDS folder in Windows, and we're now going to the file to edit it. So DC clone config dot. I think we have one too many C's in the DC clone file. There you go. And let's try running it. There you go. That's the file that we want. And we now want to put in settings for that cloned DC that we just ran the file to create. So we have the computer name that we gave it. We have the default first site, gave that name. And let's look at the IP settings. We're going to take out dynamic and we're going to put static, because we want to put static for our addresses. For the static settings, we're going to type address. So we want to type the address. We're actually going to type that in. And we're going to give the address 1010. And let's not use 10 since we're on this subnet with 192. Let's use a 192 address for the static IP4 address. So 192.168.10 and 45. Let's close that. We also want to give the subnet mask and the default gateway. So we're actually going to type those into subnet mask. So notice that we can come to this file and we can edit it manually. And our subnet mask is going to be 255.255.255.0 and close the subnet mask. We also want a default gateway. So let's put that in. And our default gateway address is 192.168.10.200. And let's close. Let's go back here and take out that greater than sign. We don't need that. So subnet mask, beginning and ending. Default gateway, beginning and ending, with the setting in between. Then we have the DNS resolver, which we had put in when we were creating the file. And we're going to change the dynamic settings here to static. And that is our DC clone config XML file. And we want to save that file. We're now into Hyper-V. This is the domain controller that you see here that we were working with. It has all the settings that we've specified in the DC clone config file. And what we want to do now is to export this virtual machine. So we want to right click and click on export. We're going to export this virtual machine to a folder called export, which we already created. So I'm going to click on browse and I'm going to go to the C drive. I'm going to click on export and I'm going to select that folder and click on export. So we're exporting the DC virtual file that was cloned with the settings that we configured into the folder called export on the C drive. Once we've done that, we now need to import. Very often, what you will do when you are done with your export is copy the exported virtual machine to another Hyper-V server and then import it in a different office or a different site. I'm working here with all the same stuff on the same Hyper-V server. So it will be just another domain controller in Hyper-V right here. So we're going to import, and this virtual machine is going to be on this host. So we want to right click and click on import virtual machine. Click next. And we have to go to the folder where we exported that virtual machine. So we click on browse, go to the C drive, and we want to click on export because export is the folder where we save that file. Double click on export and there we can see the virtual machine that we exported. So we're going to click on it and click select folder. We want to specify the folder containing the virtual machine to import. So we can see it here. It was in the export folder. It's called DC. And we are now importing it. So we want to click next. Click next again. And here we want to click copy the virtual machine, create a new unique ID. Because remember that the clone now has to be unique. We already put in all the unique settings like the IP address and the default gateway and the DNS addresses and the subnet mask. But we need to click here, copy the virtual machine because we need to give it a new unique ID. So we click on next. And we want to store the machine in a different location. We need to do that because I'm importing on the same server from which I exported that original machine. I'm doing everything, remember, on one machine, so I need to put a different directory here. If not, we would run into conflicts. So I am going to choose a different location. And we're going to choose a folder I already created called import. So we click on import, select folder. We should do the same thing for the checkpoint store. Everything there is going into the import folder. We do the same thing for the smart paging folder. Then we want to click on Next to continue. And we have to do the same thing for the storage folders. So we're going to change that location again to the import folder. So we're importing everything into that import folder. So we click Next and we click Finish. And you can see it has the same name. What we need to do is to rename the DC. The settings that we had configured in the DC clone config file, those settings are still there. If we were to start the machine, it will start as server 12. But on the interface here, with the name of the machine itself, we have to rename it. This is just a display name. So we're going to right click on DC. We're going to click on rename. And we're going to call it server 12. Which is the name that we gave it when we were creating the DC clone config file. We want to click on Enter to accept that name. So we have exported the cloned virtual machine, and we have imported the cloned virtual machine. In this session, we looked at cloning a domain controller. We went through the steps of creating the cloned domain controller. We exported that cloned domain controller, and then we imported the cloned domain controller. So now you have a new, unique cloned domain controller ready to go. This is the end of our session on cloning a domain controller, and I want to thank you for listening.